Okay. All right. This is part one of a two-part talk. Today we're going to be, I kind of frame this as like a problem solution kind of talk. Today we're going to be talking about your rights as creators and the major problem at the intersection of those rights with generative AI as today. And then next week we'll be talking more about solutions to the problems that arise at this intersection. So for those of you who don't know me, and I know most of you already, but hello, my name is Laura Smith. I'm a librarian here. I've been here since 2013. I do have a couple of caveats. I am not a copyright lawyer, and it's against the librarian code of ethics to give legal advice. I'm also not a computer scientist, and I'm not even a visual artist. So take everything I say that in mind. I am a professional librarian. I stand behind my research. And I'm happy to provide citations of anything that I say or find today. You're welcome to contact me for citations. But my views and opinions are my own, do not represent the opinions of the library as a whole. And here's my contact information should you want it. And it'll be again at the end of that presentation as well. I'm going to throw a lot of information at you today. And if there's one thing that I want you guys to remember when you walk out the door, even if everything else like dribbles out your ears as I'm saying it, that's fine. One thing I wanted to stick with you is that authors' rights are human rights. Yeah. So says the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which dates all the way back to the end of World War II, which states that everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which they are the author. We'll be talking about moral interests a little bit more in a little bit. Material interests include copyright, which is your exclusive right to copy, sell, distribute, adapt, and derive, and perform and display anything of which you are the author. And I really want to hammer this home because I feel like there's this growing perception that copyright is somehow old-fashioned, that it's somehow irrelevant in today's world. But this is not true. Material interests in your work are a fundamental right to be universally protected. So says the UN. Now, I'm not going to try and spend a whole lot of time trying to convince you that we are facing crisis as created. I'm going to let this guy do it for me. Steven Zapata is an artist, illustrator, and concept designer. He's become an outspoken advocate for authors and artists' rights. He does a lot of work for animation and gaming studios. And so he really has the credibility and the knowledge to speak very cogently on this issue. So we're going to watch a little bit of a video that he made last year. We're not going to watch the whole thing. It's very long. I do have a link to it here. And I have to warn you, he gets a little snarky at you. So fair warning.
I am shocked that I have to say the things I am about to say. To have to earnestly grapple with artificial intelligences that make art is a topic so fantastical, so absurdly science fiction, that I sometimes have difficulty taking it seriously. Unfortunately, I must take it seriously. Our AIs are here, and I have found the lugubrious shadow they are casting on the artistic discourse and the minds of students difficult to ignore. I have structured this essay as a series of counterarguments to a few of the most common rejoinders around AI art. After that, I plan to lash you to a post and flog you publicly for your lack of resistance. That should, I hope, capture the scope of the absurdity at play here. I want to be clear up front that the coming arguments are not about whether AI art is art or not. I have no problem saying it is art. That just doesn't amount to much within the substance of this argument. It goes without saying that human beings can express themselves with absolutely anything. And so long as there is expression involved, one will probably experience their work as art and feel themselves to be an artist. But the forthcoming arguments aren't about that point. They're about the flawed, unethical, and deceptive environment around AI systems. One that I will argue is poised and promises to take things in a very unartistic direction. It's not hard to imagine an ethical and consent-based generative AI image system, and that only makes it all the more galling that the ones being released now are emphatically not. I also want to say that I, as a person of this world and time, am as morbidly curious as to what these systems can create as anyone else. And I am certain that I will be deeply moved by examples of AI art in the future. However, the interesting possibilities in AI art do not mean that the horrendous oversights and anti humanist values of its current systems are above reproach. I must admit that I will be engaging in some fortune telling in this discussion, but considering the subject matter, I think that is inevitable, necessary, and actually desirable. Most of us would have called the current state of these systems a fantastical impossibility just 10 years ago, and they might not have snuck up on us and disarmed us so easily if we had been willing to project a little further into the future. I have heard arguments that try to end this whole discussion before it starts. They mainly take the shape of technical assertions that these text to image systems cannot get better based on the nature of their design, and that we are already seeing their finished form. I am not a machine learning expert, programmer, or software engineer, but I must say, I find that hard to believe, given that they have already improved since previous inferior iterations. I want to make very clear, however, that even if you don't extrapolate into the future and contend only with the current state of the art, the way these AIs are being trained, released, used, and marketed right now in the present is already grounds for serious concern. If these AI systems are allowed to propagate unchecked in the way that they have thus far, a dangerous precedent will be set, revealing that visual artists are unwilling to defend themselves and their work against theft and exploitation. And have no doubt, that is what is happening here. In their current state and along their current trajectory, these systems are heavily based on the opportunistic collection and exploitation of large amounts of creative work from huge numbers of people with no consent or compensation. To signal to these companies, including the ones to come, that artists will allow this with little resistance will not bode well for the commercial industries, for fine artists, for hobbyists, everyone. And I am baffled by my friends and peers who are looking into the mouth of the lion and saying it might be hospitable in there after all because they glimpsed some bits of food stuck to the teeth. I am as aware as you are that false certainty about monumental technological events like these doesn't mean much in the warring maelstrom of history. But we must recognize that kneeling to this brute fact does not always make us wise. Rather, it renders us mute and docile, and that is the last thing we as artists need right now. We must be willing to defend ourselves, each other, and our work, even though these AI companies will try to cast us as whiny and ungrateful. Don't let them control the narrative and lull you into compliance. We should be mad about this. These systems are collecting artists' work and employing it in for profit commercial ventures, which they often hide behind the smokescreen of their nonprofit status, citing the intent of academic research, making them difficult to attack.
We're going to stop there. There's a lot more to this essay. I have a link to it at the end of the slides if you would like to see the rest of it. I hope we didn't get too insulting there. We lashed you to a post and flogged you publicly. But there's one thing that I really want to take away from that video, and that is him saying, we should be mad about this. We should be, it's okay to be mad about this. So who is affected most? Who's most vulnerable to these abuses? In the visual arts, it tends to be those whose work is born digital. For the mere fact that their work is usually online and easily scraped. Otherwise, it's usually those so-called low art fields. But really, it's anyone who shares their work online. And if you're 3D artists out there, don't think that they're not coming for you too, because they will eventually come for you as well. Right? In other fields, it's again these low art fields. I think that there's this perception that children don't deserve quality entertainment or quality media. Last year, the former CTO of OpenAI, who is the maker of ChatGPT and image generator DALL-E, said, yes, it's true, creative jobs are going to be lost to AI, but those jobs probably shouldn't have existed in the first place. Which is bizarre because their system wouldn't exist if people hadn't done these jobs and hadn't been doing these jobs for many, many years. I've also heard tech bros say that AI is only going to replace bad artists, not the good artists. And I think that they don't really understand that to have that upper echelon of great artists, you need that whole pipeline of talented amateurs, of not so talented amateurs, of hobbyists and dilettantes and students and young people. You don't get greatness at the top without a whole pyramid of maybe not so great underneath. And I also think that doesn't take into account that not all great artists are recognized in their own lifetimes. We have people like Kafka or Vincent van Gogh or Antonio Vivaldi who are never recognized as great masters of their field until well after their deaths. So this argument that it's only going to replace the bad artists kind of pisses me off. So, unless you've been living under a rock for the last few years, you've probably heard of generative AI. When we're talking about image generators, those models are built on large language models, which is what underpins text generators. But they pair that with a system called a diffusion model. And that allows it to produce images according to a user prompt into the system. Some common ones that you may have heard of include DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, Firefly. The newest one on the scene from the Chinese company DeepSeek, their image generator is called GenAI. So we're going to talk just briefly about how these guys work. And again, this is not a long video, but it explains far better than I could how a stable diffusion model, a diffusion model works.
For an image generator to be able to respond to so many different prompts, it needs a massive, diverse training dataset, like hundreds of millions of images scraped from the internet along with their text descriptions. Those captions come from things like the alt text that website owners upload with their images for accessibility and for search engines. So that's how engineers get these giant datasets, but then what do the models actually do with them? We might assume that when we give them a text prompt, like a banana inside a snow globe from 1960, they search through the training data to find related images and then copy over some of those pixels. But that's not what's happening. The new generated image doesn't come from the training data. It comes from the latent space of the deep learning model. That'll make sense in a minute. First, let's look at how the model learns. If I gave you these images and told you to match them to these captions, you'd have no problem. But what about now? This is what images look like to a machine, just pixel values for red, green, and blue. You just have to make a guess, and that's what the computer does too, at first. But then you could go through thousands of rounds of this and never figure out how to get better at it, whereas a computer can eventually figure out a method that works. That's what deep learning does. In order to understand that this arrangement of pixels is a banana and this arrangement of pixels is a balloon, it looks for metrics that help separate these images in mathematical space. So how about color? If we measure the amount of yellow in the image, that would put the banana over here and the balloon over here in this one-dimensional space. But then what if we run into this? Now our yellowness metric isn't very good at separating bananas from balloons. We need a different variable, so let's add an axis for roundness. Now we've got a two-dimensional space with the round balloons up here and the banana down here. But if we look at more data, we may come across a banana that's pretty round and a balloon that isn't. So maybe there's some way to measure shininess. Balloons usually have a shiny spot. Now we have a three-dimensional space. And ideally, when we get a new image, we can measure those three variables and see whether it falls in the banana region or the balloon region of the space. But what if we want our model to recognize not just bananas and balloons, but all these other things? Yellowness, roundness, and shininess don't capture what's distinct about these objects. We need better variables, and we need a lot more of them. That's what deep learning algorithms do as they go through all the training data. They find variables that help improve their performance on the task, and in the process, they build out a mathematical space with way more than 3 dimensions. We are incapable of picturing multidimensional space, but Midjourney's model offered this, and I like it. So we'll say this represents the latent space of the model, and it has more than 500 dimensions. Those 500 axes represent variables that humans wouldn't even recognize or have names for, but the result is that the space has meaningful clusters. A region that captures the essence of banananess, a region that represents the textures and colors of photos from the 1960s, an area for snow and an area for globes and snow globes somewhere in between. Any point in this space can be thought of as the recipe for a possible image, and the text prompt is what navigates us to that location. But then there's one more step. Translating a point in that mathematical space into an actual image in pixel space involves a generative process called diffusion. It starts with just noise and then, over a series of iterations, arranges pixels into a composition that makes sense to humans. Because of some randomness in the process, it will never return exactly the same image for the same prompt. And if you enter the prompt into a different model designed by different people and trained on different data, you'll get a different result because you're in a different latent space.
So I hope that explains a little bit. That's as far as I understand it. It's obviously a very sophisticated piece of technology. But one of the reasons it is so hard to understand is actually because we're dealing with what is known as a black box system. And what that means is that the only things that we can see in this system are the inputs, the training data, and the user prompts, and the outputs, the images or texts or music that it produces on the other end. There is not a lot of concrete understanding about what happens in that latent space. And in fact, even developers of AI systems don't know how they work in there. Wow. There is not really a practical understanding of how they function at that level because we don't really know what it's doing. We built it, we trained it, we don't really know what it's doing. Just a little more. One of the reasons I wish we understood these things better is because how we talk about things matters. It's easy to see why we as individuals or the press or even the developers of these systems resort to analogy, resort to anthropomorphizing these systems. This often happens when we encounter a brand new technology. We go back, we fall back on things that we already know about, that we already understand, in order to make sense of this new technology. Even if those terms and that understanding is not very precise for the current situation. But those terms and that understanding, in turn, end up coloring how we understand that new thing. Using anthropomorphic language when you're discussing AI systems confuses and obscures the very vast differences between how humans learn and how AI systems function. And the term itself, to me, kind of betrays that imprecision. We tend to think of computers in general as coming from this sterile vacuum, right? But in reality, these systems are neither artificial nor intelligent. It is not artificial, as we've seen. They are built on the backs of the labor of millions of creative people with no compensation, credit, or consent. The data sets also need to be curated and labeled. This is often done by very low-paid workers in developing countries. And we're talking about toxic content from the worst corners of the internet, child pornography, torture porn, really horrible things that they have had diagnoses of PTSD from having to view and label this content. It also takes a huge amount of constant, ongoing fine-tuning of these systems. People test and retest and prompt these systems and then rate the answers. So that's why they're trying to figure out how to make it so that they rate the different answers that come out of these systems or the different images of how accurate the humans think they are, because the machine can't tell how accurate or truthful these things are. So it takes a whole lot of fine tuning. That's why you get AI systems telling you that you should eat a rock a day. That seems like logical medical advice. That's the kind of fine tuning that's taking place behind the system. And there is also a very huge environmental impact of these systems. One single conversation with ChatGPT uses 5 to 10 times the amount of energy as a search box search, and about 500 milliliters of water for every conversation that you have with ChatGPT. And that's just the operational use. Training these models is even more resource intensive, so much so that it's forcing utility companies to postpone the closure of coal-fired power plants. They're thinking of reopening 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor. So after a decade or more of Silicon Valley businesses touting their sustainability claims, Last year, the CEO of Google said, well, we weren't going to meet those goals anyway, so just forget about it. So it's not self-generating. It's built on the backs of precarious and stolen labor and extensive resource usage. It is also not intelligent. It has no understanding of the prompts that it is given or the outputs that it produces. It is merely predicting the next word, the next pixel over, the next note in a song, which is why it sometimes gives you, say, images of female popes. It doesn't understand that that is not a real thing. It has no relationship to the truth. These are sometimes called hallucinations, which is another anthropomorphic language, since hallucinating is a purely cognitive endeavor. I've heard it called bullshit. My favorite term so far is botshit, coined by the Guardian journalist. I quite like that. It does not learn or reason, no matter what the AI marketing people will tell you. An AI system needs to process, for example, tens of thousands of images of a dog before it can even approximate a new image of a dog. And you can contrast that very easily with how humans learn. Humans can extrapolate and generalize based on a very small sample size. For good and ill, right? This is not always a good thing if humans do that. Even very young babies can recognize a dog, whether it's a German Shepherd, an unfamiliar dog, whether it's a German Shepherd or a Dachshund or a Husky or a wolf or a stuffed animal or a cartoon dog or a highly stylized illustration. They can extrapolate and recognize because they have human brains. It also cannot infer. This is sometimes called the Tom Cruise's mother problem or the reversal curves. You can ask an AI system, who is Tom Cruise's mother? I'll tell you probably. Her name is Mary Lee, sorry, Tom Cruise. Mary Lee Pfeiffer. But if you ask it, who is Mary Lee Pfeiffer's son? It can't figure that out because it cannot go from A to B and say B is A. Nothing in its training data frames that piece of information in that framework, right? So it looks through its training data and it doesn't have anything about who is Mary Lee Pfeiffer's son because everything in their training data is focused on Tom Cruise, not Mary Lee Pfeiffer, who none of us have ever heard of or seen or know about. This is also why AI driving systems are not very good and cannot recognize obstacles in the road because not every single configuration of, say, an overturned semi-trailer is in their training data. So they see a new configuration, they can't figure out what it is, and they usually just stop. It cannot reference. You hear a lot of tech pros saying that AI just references like a human artist would. This is intellectually dishonest at best. When a human artist copies or references a master work, it's because of some underlying meaning or significance in that work. But the AI doesn't understand that significance. It doesn't understand that. When an artist references a work or a style, they also inevitably add something new of themselves. Otherwise, it's just forgery, which I understand is frowned on in the art world. But it is something that AIs are very adept at, right? You can tell it to actually reproduce paintings and pieces in their entirety, verbatim, so to speak. Because AI has nothing new to add except what's in its data set. And I cannot imagine. Its output is limited by and solely determined by its training data. It cannot add anything new, and that is simply not the case, as we know, with the human brain and the human imagination. So, while we're on the matter of language, I want to clarify there are many different types of artificial intelligence. It's getting really hard to tell them about the part these days, so much so that last year the FTC started cracking down on what they termed AI washing, because everybody and their dog is just putting the word AI in their product and seeing their stocks fly up. Even if it's not actually AI, and there is generally no distinction between the different types of artificial intelligence. When I say generative AI, I am not talking about reactive AI or predictive AI or neurosymbolic AI. These we've had for years. We play against them in video games. They can beat us at chess. They can beat us at Go. They underpin things like recommendation engines, facial recognition software, even our GPS system. That's predictive AI. It's part of what won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry last year, was neurosymbolic AI. But these are not generative AI. Generative AI is also not artificial general intelligence, which is a totally theoretical technology that they keep promising is months or even weeks away. They've been promising this for 3 years now. I don't believe it, and a lot of AI experts don't believe this either. Meta's chief of AI last year said that large language models, the underpinning of generative AI, were an offering to artificial general intelligence. Bill Gates said last year that generative AI has plateaued and isn't going to get any better. And Sam Altman himself, who is the CEO of OpenAI and generally agreed is the messiah of generative AI, has said that the era of large language models is already over. So I want to be clear, I am not against artificial intelligence in general. My complaint is with generative AI, which is why I will sometimes make the mistake and just say AI, but I do always try to say generative AI. Okay, so let's talk about where this content comes from. Where do these data sets come from that are used in these latent spaces? When we're talking about image generators, it is believed that most of them were trained on a data set called the Lion 5B. Now I say it's believed because we don't know for sure, because of most of these companies do not release their training data. They ironically rely on a lot of the same intellectual property protection that they're accused of violating. It contains 5.85 billion text and image pairs scraped from the publicly available internet. Its developers specifically note that it should be used for research purposes and not for industrial or commercial purposes. Now, a lot of GenAI companies were founded as nonprofit research firms, but they have all now been operating as for-profit enterprises for a couple of years. Last year, OpenAI made an investment deal where if they do not remove entirely the nonprofit portion of their business in 2 years, they have to give all their investor money back. So that's going away soon. And they specifically note that these images contained in the data set are under their own copyright. So what happens when you train on a data set that's full of images, copyrighted images? Sometimes it will reproduce pieces of watermarks or even artist signatures, the very things meant to prevent misappropriation of images. And this is very unwise because Getty, if you know anything about Getty, you know that they are notorious litigious. And we will see that they have taken steps to make sure that they get their stuff out of these data sets. Sometimes you just get straight up outputs that are just straight up copyright infringement. These were made with Midjourney, popular 90s animated cartoon with yellow skin. That's The Simpsons, and that is copyright infringement. It can also directly mimic artists' styles, which when you're talking about Monet or George O'Keeffe, doesn't really feel that terrible. But when you're talking about living artists, like Mike Mignola, the creator of Hellboy, or Holly Menger, the animator, feels a little bit more problematic. So people do not like this. Creators do not like this. As soon as these systems came to the fore, there was pushback. In December 2022, users of the portfolio station platforms ArtStation and DeviantArt flooded those homepages with images like these in protest of the tech companies' misappropriation of their work, including from ArtStation itself, which opted everything on the whole site into AI training with no consent or even notification. Other protests involved this group called Pause AI, who for the last year have been staging sit-ins at the OpenAI offices in San Francisco. They object to the wholesale scraping of intellectual property, although their main concern is the existential threat of AI. These protests started when OpenAI announced that they quietly changed their usage policies to remove the ban on weapons and warfare uses of their AI. And of course, if you've heard just a couple weeks ago, Google followed suit by dropping their pledge to use AI for weapons or surveillance, just completely abandoning any pretense of adherence to their old motto, don't be evil. There have also been a number of strikes involving generative AI. I'm sure we all remember the writers' strike a couple of summers ago. They were looking for protections against AI. There was also the SAG-AFTRA actors' strike. They were looking to prevent background actors, voiceover actors, and even dead actors from being replaced with AI. This was an almost strike from the Animation Guild after months of tech negotiations. Last November, they finally did settle on a contract agreement that contained AI protections. And there's actually another actors' strike by the video game performers branch of SAG-AFTRA. These are voiceover actors and motion capture performers. This strike is actually still ongoing. They have not struck a deal in almost 9 months. There have also been a number of anti-AI statements from artists and advocacy groups banning the use of AI in any awards competitions, objecting to the training of AI on copyrighted materials. The Society of Illustrators former president said we need to do the brave thing and not accept this form of artistic automation. The National Cartoonist Society president has said that we need litigation and public debate in order to move the needle on this. The Association of American Editorial Cartoonists also released a statement. I couldn't find a pithy quote for them. And then there's the Artists' Rights Alliance, who has called AI an assault on creativity. And it's been signed by many artists: Sheryl Crow, Aerosmith, State of Bob Marley, Robert Smith of The Cure, lots of people. There have also been a lot of petitions. The biggest one has kind of coalesced around this guy, who used to work for one of the biggest companies using copyrighted materials before he resigned in protest of this very issue. He's a Cambridge-educated musician, and he's pointed out the costs of these models. There are 3 resources that you need. They spend billions of dollars on people and compute, but they want that third one, that data. They just think they can take it for free. I like that he says when AI companies call this training data, they're really dehumanizing it. What we're talking about is people's work. Their writing, their art, their music. So he's drafted this very simple statement that you can sign at this website. It's up to 43,000 signatures, something like that. The unlicensed use of creative works for training generative AI is a major unjust threat to the livelihoods of the people behind those works and must not be permitted. Pretty simple. There have also been calls for boycotts, notably by this guy, Gary Marcus, who is an MIT-educated cognitive scientist, professor of neuroscience, and the founder of several AI companies. He's become a leading critic of the hype surrounding generative AI and warns of over-anthropomorphizing, misinformation at a massive scale, and the theft of intellectual property. He has warned that they will not stop with the creatives. If we let them get away with this, they will come for every profession that they can. In his latest book, which we have at the library, by the way, he calls for a public boycott of generative AI, arguing that we cannot rely on government regulation because there is way too much money in politics from Silicon Valley. Even before the election of President Musk, Trump, we saw the California Governor Gavin Newsom veto all of the AI regulation bills, the bipartisan bills that his legislator had passed, because there's so much money, so much pressure on him. This book was published last year. And in it, he warns that tech oligarchs will try to seize the reins of government power, which I think is pretty prescient considering what's happened in the last couple of months. He is not hopeful for meaningful regulation, which is why he thinks we need public protest and public boycott, or nothing will be done to protect us from these. If AI is really here to stay, which we're always told that it's here to stay, right? And it probably is, but that means that now is the time to move the needle towards a more ethical development of this technology. All right, and then that brings us to the lawsuits, and there are a lot of lawsuits. We're not going to go through all of them, obviously. It's getting really hard to keep up with all of the lawsuits, but these are just the lawsuits concerning copyright issues. There are a slew of other lawsuits against generative AI companies alleging things like negligence, wrongful death. These are just the copyright lawsuits. We have lawsuits about creative works. We have lawsuits about journalistic work. This last one, the Condé Nast one, was just filed last week. They are just coming hot and heavy. And we also have I don't even know what these 3 are about. I haven't even been able to look into them. They are super, there are just so many of them. I want to look a little bit closer at this last one. And it's Richard Kadri versus Meta. There are actually a slew of plaintiffs in this one, but he's the only named one. This case is now in discovery, and just last week, some unredacted emails from Meta, who owns Facebook, came to light. Facebook has now been forced to admit that they illegally downloaded more than 80 terabytes of data from pirate and shadow libraries on the internet. To give you a sense of scale, it is estimated that 10 terabytes, would be enough to fit the entire printed collection of the Library of Congress. So this is 8 times that amount of illegal downloading. Their own employees knew that this was wrong. One of them wrote to their own legal department saying, "This doesn't feel right." Laughing emoji, okay. And using pirated material should be beyond our ethical threshold. They didn't stop doing this. Instead, they pivoted and started downloading these things in stealth mode. That's what their legal department called it. They bypassed their own servers so that it would be harder to trace their download. Individuals have been criminally prosecuted for downloading much less information than this. In 2011, Aaron Swartz, who is a programmer and internet activist, downloaded 70 gigabytes of articles from the academic publisher JSTOR. I think it's a helpful calculation. That's 0.0875% of what Meta is accused of. He was faced with a $1 million fine, 35 years in prison, and sadly, he killed himself over this. So we're going to see what Facebook does. And internet kills. Okay, and then this is the one last lawsuit involving text generators, and I want to talk about it because this is the only one that has concluded. This was just ruled on a few weeks ago, and it was a huge win for the plaintiffs, Thomson Reuters, who accused the Roth Intelligence of illegally scraping their legal database Westlaw into a generative AI product. The judge ruled against them last week, saying none of their defenses hold water. I reject them all. So that was, we'll be coming back to Reuters v. Roth in just a bit. So keep that in the back of your head. There's also suits involving code generators, music generators, and of course, image generators. And we're going to look a little bit closer at this last one, Anderson v. Stability AI. The plaintiffs in this case are Carla Ortiz, who is a concept designer. She's credited with the character design of Doctor Strange. Sarah Anderson, who's a cartoonist and illustrator. You've probably seen her work somewhere. It's very prolific. And Kelly McKiernan, who's also an author and illustrator. I think this case, I'm not a lawyer, but I think this case has a really good chance of success, in part because, again, of some really boneheaded things that these companies get caught in. In a series of Twitter posts, and yes, I'm dead in Twitter. I'm not calling it. Artist John Lamb posted a series of screenshots of conversations between Stability AI employees, including their CEO, talking about creating a database of more than 16,000 artists, living and dead, that the system would be trained to mimic pre-rendered, so they could do it super fast to mimic these styles in specific. And he just says, no, just give me 16,000, just dump them in there, whatever. It's very cavalier. But then they start talking about data monitoring. All you have to do is use those data sets and then conveniently forget what you used to train the model. Boom! Legal problem solved forever. Unless somebody takes a screenshot of your conversation, you idiot. So these were submitted. Oh, there's also a screenshot of the artists scrolling through this 16,000 list of the artists that it would be pre-trained to mimic. This suit was advanced to discovery last August, with the judge noting specifically that Stable Diffusion was built to a significant extent on copyrighted works, and that they might even be guilty of promoting infringement because their system seems designed to facilitate infringement by design. Okay, we're going to back up a little bit and talk about what we're talking about. Intellectual property is an umbrella term. Yes.
Before you move on to that, seeing that there's like China with DeepSeek and lots of other places that are participating in this, and the lawsuits are evidently USA.
There are many other lawsuits in the EU and Canada. There are lawsuits all over the world. Yeah, and it's hard to, when you have multinational companies, it is hard to know how any kind of legal decision will impact their global operations, right? Will they only apply here in the US? How would that work? It gets very confusing when you have these huge, powerful corporations. All right, intellectual property is an umbrella term that contains not only copyright, but also patents, moral rights, which we mentioned before. That includes your right to attribution, that your work deserves to have your name on it, or deserves to have no name on it, or a pen name on it. And it also includes the integrity of your work, that your work can't be sliced up on. It also includes the right of publicity, sometimes called personality rights. You have the right to your name, your voice, your likeness, which that is also actually coming under attack by generative AI. And the Copyright Office has also released some guidance on replicas because that's becoming a real problem. It also includes indigenous rights, which is a little bit different from regular copyright. They're usually held collectively by a tribe rather than an individual. And they don't necessarily exist in a fixed medium. We're talking about ceremonial rights, symbolisms, things like that that aren't necessarily in a tangible medium, like most things that are protected by IP rules are. Here's some history. I'm not going to go through this, but it's in your slide handout. So if you ever need a tidbit for your next dinner party, who doesn't think that copyright history is just super interesting? Super interesting. Copyright in the US The last major revision was in 1976. It replaced the code that dated back to 1909. In 1991, George Herbert Walker Bush signed the Visual Artists' Rights Act, which guaranteed moral rights for visual artists. In 1998, we have the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, derisively called the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. That was an act that protected internet service providers from liability in the case of infringing content appearing on their platforms. If you've ever seen, like, if you're looking at a post that you looked at before and it says, this content is no longer available, that is the DCMA. That's what happens to that. That's got to take down. In 2018, we passed the Music Modernization Act, which included licensing rules and copyright clarifications for the modern era of music. Okay, so when we apply this law, we see that it applies to original works of authorship. You can't copyright facts or scientific principles or basic ideas. It has to be original works of authorship, but that's in any tangible medium of expression, whether that's clay or painting or pixels or metal or anything like that. So it applies to any and all media. Your creations are automatically protected as they are created. It is a moment of fixation kind of protection, but it is a temporal right. It does not last forever. The current term is the life of the author plus 70 years, at which point a work will enter the public domain. We will get back to as well. This protects your exclusive rights to make, sell, and distribute copies, adapt your work, or make derivatives. And importantly for artists, it is distinct from your material object. If you sell a piece of your work to someone, the copyright does not transfer with the physical object. You still own the copyright to that, even if you sold the piece itself. Copyright can only be transferred in writing. The exception to this is sometimes called work for hire. This is not a common situation, but if you are creating work as part of your regular duties, and the common example is a cartoonist working for a daily newspaper, the cartoons that he makes are not technically his. They are, the copyright is owned by the newspaper. If you're working under contract for the school, maybe you're taking photographs or something, again, that would be a work for hire. And then there's also these other types of works that apply. This is not common, but if you do have contracts that you're signing for your work, make sure you read them carefully to make sure that the work that you're producing under those contracts stays yours. Other ineligible works. Some of these may be protected by other forms of intellectual property law, like patents or trademarks. But this last one is an interesting case. Works created by nature or animals. In 2011, this selfie taken by an Indonesian macaque. It was taken during an excursion by a British photographer, but the picture itself was ruled to be in the public domain because he didn't take the photograph, the monkey did. So this is ruled to be in the public domain because copyright is a human right, not a macaque right. I have a special note here on photography. If any of you guys are photographers, copyright gets a little even more fuzzier in this domain. It is not infringement to take a photograph of something that has been photographed before. Your copyright only applies to the expression of you, the photographer, not the surrounding ideas and environment. And to give you an example of how weird this can get, in 2004, the photographer here sued the photographer here for copyright infringement, but it was ruled not infringement because Mr. Sahuk's copyright only covered the expression of that capture at the moment. So the lighting, exposure, timing, angle, position, framing, all those things. He does not have copyright over the lights, the statue, the cathedral itself, the gates that are in there. And so even though Mr. Tucker took this photograph, after seeing this photograph in a gallery in New Orleans, it was ruled non-infringing because those things, position, framing, lighting, exposure, are sufficiently different. Yeah, it's a little weird. All right, what else is an infringement? Sometimes creators choose not to protect their rights, like Alexander Fleming when he invented penicillin, or Gerald Holton, the creator of the peace sign. He created that in 1958 for the British Nuclear Disarmament Society. I just made that up. Like that, I don't know. But he specifically didn't copyright it because he wanted it to be used by other nuclear disarmament groups around the world. We also have memes and sharing culture. These are designed and intended to be shared. The creator of this, I don't know what we're calling Post on Blue Sky now. Anybody heard anything? No, me neither. Okay, well, the creator of this post wants this post to be shared, right? That's largely the point of platforms like this. So that's not infringement to share these memes like that. Oftentimes, we also have memes that are based on underlying intellectual property. This one is based on the NBC show The Good Place, which if you guys haven't seen it, it's a show. It's hilarious. It's very rare that you get a sitcom that's about ethical things.
What one is it?
It's called The Good Place. But memes are created with the express purpose to be shared. And they also don't create a substitute for the original. Nobody's going to look at this and be like, well, I guess I don't need to watch that show now, because you're not getting much out of this one shot. There have been cases, however, of people using memes or stock photography for memes for political campaigns or advertisements, and they have gotten sued. So as long as you're not sharing these things for purposes of influence or money, you're good to go. Also, things in the public domain. Things in the public domain include things that were never eligible for copyright, which includes things that were produced by the federal government, which incidentally is the largest producer of information in the world. So we have this famous photograph, My Mother by Dorothea Lange, public domain, because she took it under the auspices of the Works Progress Administration. So it's not actually hers, it was a work for hire for the government. It also includes, the public domain also includes things that have timed out of that author's life plus 70 years. So just last year, Mickey Mouse sort of came into the public domain, but only the Steamboat Willie version of Mickey Mouse. Later iterations of Mickey Mouse are still under copyright protection. As you can see, it gets a little weird in there. Things that have Creative Commons license. Creative Commons is a licensing scheme that anyone can use. It's free to use, and it helps you make choices and let people know on the internet how you want your work to be used and shared. The site here can explain much more about that. This is something that you and I can use. We put it on our works, and it tells people what you can do with my work. Also, satire and parody are not infringement. That's how Weird Al and The Onion and SNL can use likenesses and logos and things like that and not be infringing. Although I would like to mention that Weird Al apparently asks for permission each and every time he uses a song. But he's just kind of a classic guy. Which is another difference between people and machines. And the last exception is fair use. If your use is non-commercial or educational or non-competitive, it is often considered fair use. Like the videos and images in this presentation, here I am in a classroom. I don't need to seek permission from rights holders. I don't need to pay for the images that I'm using. Although you'll notice I have been putting image credits on all of these. And I actually personally asked Steven Zapata if I could use his video, because I knew it was going to be posted in turn on the internet. And I wanted to be happy, like Weird Al. Okay, so fair use is a major exception to copyright protections, and it's the exception that AI companies rely on to pass off their infringement as okay. They assert that their use is fair. The purpose of the fair use exception is to promote freedom of expression by permitting unlicensed use of copyright protected works in certain circumstances. But fair use is not a fixed term with firm rules. It has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. There are 4 factors, and they exist on a spectrum. So here we have, usually when you weigh each factor, you come down on one side or the other, whether or not it's fair or not. So here we have commercial use, probably not fair. Nonprofit, educational, transformative, more likely to be fair. Using unpublished or highly creative works, less likely to be fair. Published and factual works, likely to be fair. Did you use the whole thing, or did you just take a small amount or an unimportant part of the work? And the effect on the market. Does it have the potential to replace the work? That's less likely to be fair. And if there's little or no market impact, that is more likely to be fair. And I think looking at these, that the AI companies use would be pretty no-brainer unfair. It's highly commercial. They have used all sorts of works, including creative ones. There have been whole works gobbled up, and it has a tangible effect on the market, not only for individual artists and styles, but also for the very quickly growing market for licensing works to train AI systems. If you've already scraped the entirety of the New York Times off of the internet for your AI, you're not going to pay the New York Times for it again. But they have relied solely on a sub-factor of factor 1. and that is transformational use, which is more likely, though not necessarily, considered to be fair. Transformational use usually sheds new light, offering criticism or commentary on a work. We shall see how this plays out in court, but this was the issue that was ruled on in the Reuters v. Roth case about the Westlaw database. This was the crux of the case that was ruled on. The judge ruled that scraping involved was not fair use and that AI training was not sufficiently transformative. Before I let my Schadenfreude run wild with me, though, I should note that in this one case, the product that Westlaw was making was a direct and intentional substitute for Reuters' own product. So, calm myself down a little bit there. But me and the judge in this case do not think that the transformative use negates the other factors of fair use, which all weigh heavily against unfair use. If you want more information on this, I highly recommend this 42-page paper written by the former Counsel General of the United States Copyright Office, in which she talks at great length about transformativeness and the precedents that the AI companies are relying on. But there seems to be great confusion among these poor AI executives when it comes to terminology and language. To illustrate this, I'm going to show you this very quick quote. This is the CEO of Microsoft's AI division. His name is Mustafa Suleyman, and he's talking to a reporter at a conference last year.
But I want to actually ask you about the data that does exist. There are a number of authors here at the Aspen Ideas Festival and a number of journalists as well. And it appears that a lot of the information that has been trained on over the years has come from the web. And the question, and some of it's the open web and some's not, and we've heard stories about how OpenAI was turning YouTube videos into transcripts and then training on the transcripts. And who is supposed to own the IP? Who is supposed to get value from that IP? And whether, to put it in a very blunt terms, whether the AI companies have effectively stolen the world's IP.
Yeah, I think, look, it's a very fair argument. I think that with respect to content that is already on the open web, the social contract of that content since the 90s has been that it is fair use. Anyone can copy it, recreate with it, reproduce with it. That has been freeware, if you like. That's been the understanding. There's a separate...
I'm just going to stop it there in the interest of time, but this is straight up incorrect. As we have seen, most of what's on the internet is still covered by copyright protections. You can't just take anything off the internet and do with it what you will. A lot of people do, but it's not okay. You have a right to display your work on the internet, which has become the de facto town square of our era, without having to cede those moral and material interests to your work. But I think people like him kind of sow confusion between these terms on purpose, because I think it benefits them to have confusion in the public about what these terms mean. But just to be clear, the open web does not mean open access. The open web does not mean open source. Publicly available does not mean public domain. So we've talked now extensively about the problem. Let's talk a minute about how to assert your rights. The best way to do that is through copyright registration. So although copyright exists from the moment of creation, in order to press your rights in court, you do need to register your copyrights. Timely registration is best. If your work is infringed on and you only then go to register your works, you can still sue for damages, or you can sue for infringement, but your damages will be limited. So you can stop the infringement, but your losses, attorney's fees, things like that, may not be covered. Copyright registration also creates a public record of ownership, which if people do want to use your work, this is often the only way to track you down, especially if we're talking, 20, 30 years in the future. Copyright registration can help people track you down. The works can be published or unpublished, and artwork is considered published if it is offered for sale, copy, loan, rental, or lease. The mere public display does not count as publishing. That will be important in just a minute. You do not have to re-register if you publish after the fact. If you sell a painting after you've registered, you don't need to re-register. Placing the copyright symbol on your work is not a substitute for registering your work, but it is also not mandatory. So even if your work is registered, you're not required to put that copyright symbol on it. So in the new era, I would strongly advise visual artists to think about registering the copyrights for their works, especially when we're talking about major pieces or series of pieces. So how do we do that? There are 2 helpful links here to help you walk you through the steps of registration. There's a form, it's online and in paper. They want the title, the author, the date it was created, your contact information, and whether or not it is published. It's not free. It does take work to review and process these applications. So it's $45 online and $125 per paper. So obviously you're not going to register every drawing that comes off your sketch pad. But for major pieces, I think it's probably worth the investment, especially if you plan to share it or post it. They also want deposit copies. They want an entire copy of your work so that they can review it. And if it is a published work, they want a second copy. And that second copy goes to the Library of Congress. And this ensures that the Library of Congress has copies of every single copyrightable work published in the US. And that's still only 10 terabytes of data. I watched this town hall with Steven Zapata, the video guy, and with Carlo Ortiz, who is one of the plaintiffs in the stability suit. He said that he was very surprised at how easy it was to work with the Copyright Office. It is not an AI reviewing your application. These are actual people reviewing every piece and every application. But for good or ill, it does take time and effort to work through government bureaucracy. Although now we have the Department of Government Efficiency, which is going to make everything better by filing.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is published mean put online on Instagram or Facebook?
No. So the public display, including display on the internet, does not qualify to publish.
Okay.
Not for artistic works.
For copyright.
Yeah. Yep. If your work is infringed upon, you do have legal options to pursue, even if you hadn't registered that copyright before the infringement began. But federal court, as we've seen, takes years, and it is very expensive, especially if one or both sides have highly paid legal retainers that are going to drag that one forever. So there's another option. The Copyright Claims Board was founded in 2020 to provide a streamlined alternative for claims involving damages up to $30,000, which would probably cover anything that I would worry about, probably. There's no attorney required. Hearings are conducted remotely, and the website for that is right here. Consequences of infringement. If your work is infringed upon, there can be serious consequences. I think one of the most important and undervalued consequences is inspirational ones. If you feel like your work is being undervalued or misappropriated or abused, you are less likely to create more works, and the sole purpose of copyright is to promote expression, to spur the creation of original works. So if you're less likely to do that if you think your work is being misused. And when you extrapolate this to society as a whole, if these AI companies are allowed to treat artists and their art as literally worthless, then there's going to be a loss of value to art as a whole of society. For the infringer, the largest and most scary penalty is algorithmic disgorgement, which is the forced deletion of algorithms that have been illegally made, say using illegally obtained data, for example. Now I put an asterisk here because it's never actually been used in a copyright case. It has been used in other cases. It was used against Cambridge Analytica after their Facebook scandal in 2019. It was used against the photo storing app EverAlbum, which was accused of using for facial recognition software. And most recently in 2024 against Rite Aid, again, because of facial recognition software. Last year, the FTC said, the Federal Trade Commission, stated that algorithmic disgorgement would be a significant part of their AI enforcement. But of course, that was before the election, and all of those people who ran the FTC, I assume, have been fired. I haven't actually heard about that, but I assume that. And so, especially with the state of affairs today, I think it's all the more important for people like you and me to take steps to curtail the spread of this technology as it exists now. Okay, read just a little bit more, and then I'm done. What about AI-generated images? Can they be copyrighted? Well, last year, the U.S. Copyright Office came up with a policy statement, and this was just confirmed last month, that no, in fact, AI images do not meet the standard of authorship for copyright and are therefore ineligible for that kind of protection. Because they look at whether these works were conceived and executed by a human, like the macaque selfie. If it's not a human author behind it, then you can't copyright. They have determined that prompts alone do not provide sufficient human control to merit copyright protection because the machine determines how those instructions are implemented. Thus, prompts are more akin to instructions for ideas, which, as we learned, cannot copyright instructions for ideas. It is possible that modifications, significant modifications of AI-generated images may rise to the level of human authorship. But in that case, it is only the human elements that are protected by copyright. The underlying images will not be copyrightable. And the Copyright Office has said this is pretty much a case-by-case basis. They also noted that there is even less control by the user on the output when generative AI systems rewrite or modify prompts internally, which is a process called ghost prompting. So in order to try and prevent infringing images being produced, and in order to try and lessen the bias displayed by these systems, some companies have started to mediate prompts before sending them into the black box. Otherwise, because of the bias inherent in the training data, doctor would always be a man and nurse would always be a female. So users do not know, though, whether or how their own prompts are being manipulated before sending to the system. So there's even less control over the outputs than you think. The idea that you control the output is largely illusory. But still, some people have tried. In 2022, the video game developer, Jason Allen, took first prize at the Colorado State Fair's digital art category. He claimed that he disclosed that he created these using Midjourney, but the judges contend that they knew no such thing. His copyright application was rejected, which he said puts me in a terrible position with no recourse against others who are blatantly and repeatedly stealing my work. So I wonder how he feels about Midjourney himself, blatantly stealing other artists' work to begin with. In 2023, a photographer named Boris Elgitson won the World Photography Organization's award with his submission, The Electrician, which he later told the organization that he had used generative AI for. He released a statement declining the award, saying that he had only done this to show that the art and photography world was not prepared for the advent of AI. So he urged instead that the jury give the award money to a photography festival in Odessa. This one, in 2024, Jake Gouchard, a cybersecurity tech from Albuquerque, was awarded the $2,500 commission for the Albuquerque Balloon Fiesta poster, which he made using Adobe Firefly. This is especially disappointing because we are up to our eyeballs in artists here in New Mexico, artists of all stripes and all media, including digital artists, who create their own work and don't just ask a machine to do it for them. Santa Fe is still the third largest art market in the United States, and this lucrative commission and this high-profile exposure went to a tech firm. In response to the backlash, and there was a backlash, the Balloon Fiesta media relations director basically said, "Oh, yeah, we're going to think of that." Whoops. We said they'll develop guidelines for that next year.
That looks like AI.
Yeah, it does. It does. And if you look really closely, like part of the balloon isn't even attached to the basket.
Looks like AI.
And lastly, we have this 2025 in-painting image. Now, last month, the US Copyright Office did issue a limited copyright for this work, which was created by the CEO of an AI company called Invoke, created using their platform called In-Painting. So although all the elements of this painting are AI generated, after examining the piece and most importantly, its process video that was sent in as part of the application for copyright, the Copyright Office decided that the manipulation of the generated image contains sufficient amount of human authorship, but the images themselves, the pieces, are not covered by the copyright. Only the selection, arrangement, and coordination of the image are protected by copyright. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this works its way out in the courts where we, as a society, and the US Copyright Office as a government entity figures out where this threshold for human authorship really is. Because it's really kind of up in the air. Okay, one last thing. Remember those 5.85 billion images that we said were scraped as part of the Lion 5D data set? Wait, are you guys in there? Is your work in there? There's a site where you can find that out. And it's called haveibeentrained.com. It's put out by a company called Spawning AI, which has said that they are committed to consent-based ethical AI. And this site is part of their efforts to move the needle towards that. It looks like this. And it searches the data and the text within the line 5B data set. I did a search for Jeffrey Lawrence, who is the artist of the painting, The Face Healer, the painting atrium of the library. Love looking at that painting, I used to do a lot. And I searched for his name, Jeffrey Lawrence. And indeed, there is a boatload of his work in this training set. So that means that his copyrighted works have been ingested and incorporated into AI art images. I'm going to leave you with a little homework assignment if you want. I want you to go to the site and search for yourself. Search for some of the titles of your pieces, maybe, especially if you have a long-standing presence on the web. But there's a caveat, just looking for your name might not necessarily catch your images, even if the images are in there. And that's because of the inconsistent quality of the text associated with the images. So if you've just been posting to Instagram, maybe under a screen name, not your own name, you might not catch that even if it's been scraped to that data set. So that's a little caveat, but it could be fun to see if you're in there. And if you come next week, we'll learn more about this website and how you can use it to help keep your work out of future AI models. And we'll look at many other ways that you can protect your work online. So thank you so much. I have a QR code here that links to all the sources that I cited in this presentation. And if you want to, I would love to see you guys here next week, same time, same place, to learn about protecting your work online. Thank you guys so much.